Part 1. The day the police showed up at my front gate. The HOA president was standing there smiling like she had just won the biggest argument of her life. She kept repeating the same sentence over and over. "You're not part of this community." But the funny thing is, by the time that conversation ended, the police weren't asking me to leave. They were asking her to step aside. And what she learned in the next few minutes completely changed the entire neighborhood. Before we get into the story, if you enjoy crazy HOA drama and stories where entitled Karens push things way too far, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Karen Stories Daily. It really helps the channel grow, and we post stories like this all the time. Now, the strange part of this story is that it all started with a single sentence. "I'm not in your HOA." That sentence should have ended the entire situation right there. But for some reason, the HOA president took it as a challenge. You see, my house sits at the entrance of a neighborhood that was built about 10 years ago. When the developer first built the community, they bought most of the land around my property to build houses. But they never bought my land. My family had owned it long before the development existed. So, when the subdivision was finished, my property ended up sitting right next to the neighborhood entrance road. There's a long gravel driveway that leads from the road up to my house, and anyone driving through the neighborhood can see it. For years there was never a problem. People drove past, sometimes they waved. Sometimes they asked if I knew the history of the land before the neighborhood existed. But everything changed when the HOA elected a new president. Her name was Diane. Now, if you've ever lived near an HOA, you probably already know the type of person I'm talking about. Clipboard rules, and a strong belief that the entire neighborhood should operate exactly the way they imagine it. At first, I didn't think much about it, but a few weeks after Diane became president, I found a letter taped to my mailbox. It had the HOA logo on it and looked very official. The letter said my property needed to comply with neighborhood appearance standards. I remember reading it twice just to make sure I understood it correctly, because the one problem with that letter was simple. My property wasn't part of their HOA. So I ignored it. A week later, another letter appeared. This one said I needed to attend an HOA compliance meeting. Again, I ignored it. Then one afternoon I came home and saw Diane standing near my driveway entrance with two other people holding clipboards. The moment I stepped out of my truck, she walked toward me with the confident smile of someone who thought they were about to win an argument. "Hello," she said. "I'm Diane, the HOA president." I told her I had seen her letters. She nodded and pointed toward my property. "This land needs to follow our neighborhood standards." That's when I said the sentence that should have ended the conversation. "I'm not in your HOA." She blinked like she hadn't expected that answer. Then she smiled again. "Well, technically your property is surrounded by the community." I pointed to the fence line that marked the edge of their development. "And technically that fence is your boundary." For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then she wrote something on her clipboard and said they would follow up. Over the next month, the letters kept coming. Some of them mentioned compliance warnings. Others said the HOA might take action. One even suggested they could involve local authorities. At that point, I realized something. Diane genuinely believed she had authority over my property. Eventually, a neighbor from inside the subdivision stopped. By one evening, he looked a little embarrassed as he spoke. He told me that during a recent HOA meeting, Diane had said something interesting. She claimed my land had originally been part of the development plan. According to her, the property had been left out by mistake, which meant she believed the HOA should control it. When I heard that, I laughed, because the truth was the exact opposite. My land had been here decades before the developer bought the surrounding area. In fact, the developer had originally approached my family asking if we would sell. We didn't. So they built the neighborhood around us. But Diane apparently didn't know that history, or maybe she just didn't want to believe it. Either way, things escalated quickly. About 2 weeks later, I was working in my garage when I saw a police car pull up near the entrance road. Right behind it was Diane's car, and when she stepped out, she looked extremely confident. The officer walked up to me and asked if I was the property owner. I said yes. Then he asked if I was aware there had been complaints about my property violating HOA regulations. I calmly explained the situation. "My land isn't part of the HOA." The officer nodded. Slowly. Then he asked a simple question. "Have documentation for that?" I smiled, because I had something much better than documentation. I had history. And what happened next completely flipped the entire situation. When the officer asked if I had documentation proving the property wasn't part of the HOA, I nodded and told him to give me 1 minute. I walked into the house and grabbed a folder that I had kept for years. Inside that folder were the original land records for the property. But there was something even more important in that folder. A contract. When the developer built the subdivision, They needed access to the main road that runs past my property. At the time, the only way for construction trucks and utility crews to reach the site was by crossing a section of my land. So years ago, we made a deal. The developer paid my family for a permanent access agreement. That agreement allowed the neighborhood entrance road to exist. Without it, the neighborhood wouldn't even have a road connecting it to the highway. I walked back outside and handed the paperwork to the officer. He read through it carefully for a few minutes. Then he looked at Diane. Then he looked back at me just to confirm. He said, "This agreement gives the development access across your property." I nodded. "That road runs through an easement on my land." Diane's confident smile slowly disappeared. The officer continued reading. After another moment, he closed the folder and handed it back to me. Then he turned to Diane. "Mom," he said calmly, "this property is not part of your HOA." She looked completely stunned. "But the road," "Yes," the officer interrupted politely. "The road exists because of his property agreement." For a few seconds, nobody said anything. Then the officer added one more sentence. "If this easement didn't exist, the neighborhood entrance road wouldn't be here." That's when the reality finally hit her. The neighborhood wasn't controlling my property. My property was allowing the neighborhood to exist. Diane stood there silently while the officer explained that the HOA had no authority over my land. He also suggested that continuing to file complaints about property they didn't control could create legal problems. After a few more minutes, the officer got back into his patrol car and drove away. Diane and the other HOA members slowly walked back to their vehicles. No arguments. No more clipboards. Just quiet embarrassment. A few weeks later, the HOA sent out a message to residents explaining that my property was privately owned and outside their authority. After that, the letters stopped. No more warnings. No more complaints. And these days, when people drive into the neighborhood, they pass right by the same gravel driveway that has always been there. The driveway that exists on land the HOA doesn't control. Sometimes, I see people slow down as they drive past, probably remembering the story about the HOA president who called the police on a property owner, only to learn that his land was the reason their neighborhood even had an entrance road. If you enjoyed this story, let me know in the comments what you would have done in the same situation. And if you know someone who deals with HOA drama like this, share this video with them. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Karen's Stories Daily for more unbelievable neighborhood stories just like this one.